Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 7th of January of 2023. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. Of course, today we are going to start with Solidar, a town that located on the north from Bakhmut. You see, this is Bakhmut. This is the focal point of the Ukrainian military special operation. During the previous weeks, the Russians were trying to take control over this town since the end of November of 2022, and today is the 7th of January, and they still haven't able to take control over this town. They were attacking in the south, trying to take control over Kurdyumovka and Zaryanovka, Andreevka, and Klishchevka, and most of these towns are under Russian control. And these days, the Russians decided to change their focus. And during the previous week, they were completely focused on the town by the name of Solidar. Why this town is so important, we have a lot of updates, so let's discuss this. First of all, when take a look at Bakhmut, we see that the Russians managed to achieve significant success in the south. They established control over a lot of towns. Furthermore, they managed to reach some kind of canal, the Seversky Donetsk canal, this blue line. That means that they managed to get some kind of natural barrier and now they have pretty nice positions. It will take a lot of resources from the Ukrainian side to return back this position, so that's why they're pretty safe in this area. And these days the Russians try to establish control over Klishchevka, but they're not in a hurry. They're doing this operation very slow. They're attacking the Ukrainians, and I believe that these days the Russians tries not even to take control over Klishchevka, but the most important thing that the Russians want to achieve in Klishchevka is to reduce the Ukrainians as much as possible. It's some kind of a small trap. The Ukrainians understand that they need to keep control over this town. I believe that Ukrainians understand that anyway, sooner or later, this town, Klishchevka, will become a focal point for the Russians anyway, and we understand, yes, the Russians understand this as well, but at least at this point of time, Klishchevka is not so important. At least when talking about today, the 7th of January, the most important thing is to reduce the Ukrainians, but not to take control of Klishchevka. I believe that in a week or two, the Russians will receive some kind of goal to take control over it, and then they will start the real war in the south of Bakhmut. And as you can see, we see that the Russians established control over the south part of Bakhmut, over the east part of Bakhmut, and when talking about the north part of Bakhmut, they still haven't received some progress, and they need to to hurry up there, and they need to take control over at least 3 towns like Podgorodnya, Krasnogora, and Solidar. And today we receive a lot of updates from the Russians. Furthermore, you see, as you can see, the Russian sources map has been updated. Now there shows that the Russians control the town by the name of Bakhmutska. This one, the Russians developed their bridgehead in Solidar, right, in direction of the coal mines. This is the salt mines. Sorry, my bad. Furthermore, as you can see, according to the Russian sources, they are very close to Podgorodnya. At least they have encircled Podgorodnya or established control over the south and the east part of this town. Furthermore, the Russians got as close as possible to the town by the name of Krasnogora. And of course, if you follow the Russian channels, for Telegram channels to Russian military experts, you understand and you hear that the Ukrainians, according to the Russians, have been collapsed or defeated, and they have lost a lot of soldiers and were forced to step back. But as we discussed, this is not the real truth. We understand the value of Solidar, we understand the value of each of these towns. According to my understanding of the situation, when talking about the Ukrainians, at least at this stage of the special operation, everything goes according to the Ukrainian plans. And now we will discuss this situation in more details. First of all, let's take a look at the Russian sources map. They have updated their map as well, and the most important thing that we receive from this front line is that Podgorodnya has been taken by the Russians. Everything according to the military summary projection. You remember that I told you that even if the Russians are able to take any control of any of these towns, first of all, the Russians will be able to take control over Podgorodnya. And today we receive an update that the Russians established the real control control over Podgorodny. So first of all, let's update this map according to the situation we have. So according to this update, the Russians established control over Podgorodny, and now they control something like this. They got as close as possible to Krasnogora, and they managed to push the Ukrainians to the north and the central part of Solidar. When talking about Solidar, you see that there are a lot of updates as well. First of all, the Russians pushes the Ukrainians from the south, and some sources are saying that the Russians established control over the, let's say, some infrastructure, some facilities in the south, some facilities in central part of Solidar. As you can see, the Russian source map has been updated, and it shows that they managed to enter, let's say, the let's call these areas the railroad station of the salt mines in this area. Furthermore, but this is not the most important, because we received this update yesterday. We understand about the situation, and this is not the most important. First of all, let's update the map of on the Western source map for better understanding. And according to the Russian sources, now the Ukrainians have their positions along the river. And when talking about the central part of Solidar, about this area, we return back. According to the Russian source map, they entered the east side of railroad station. So that means that the Russians, according to the Russian sources, of course, managed to establish control over this part of Solidar. If it's true or not, I can't say. Anyway, I believe that this area is in the gray zone, and everything according to the situation we discussed, that Ukrainians managed to establish their position along the railroad rocket and along the river in this area. I believe that the Russians haven't managed to establish control over this part. I believe that the Russians managed to turn these areas in the gray zone, but this is not the most important. The most important update about Solidar comes from the north, from this area, and as you can see, the Russians have updated their map as well on the west part of Yakovlivka, and they're showing that the Russians established control over this building. And this is very important piece of data. This is how I can't even describe you the real value of this building. I can't explain to you the value of this building. If you are familiar with let's say the storm operation of Lysychansk and Severodonetsk agglomeration, you will understand the value of such corner building inside of the entire town. If you remember, when the Russians started their offensive operation in Severodonetsk, the first area the Russians managed to take control over is the east part of Severodonetsk. The first buildings that the Russians managed to establish control, of course, was this hospital. This hospital is located on the east part near this forest, and the Russians first they took control over this residential area. So, and there was the I don't know how to call it, the first bridgehead in Severodonetsk, and the Russians used this bridgehead as the main base, as the main area to attack the Ukrainians, and from this area the Russians were able to develop their bridgehead inside of the central part of Severodonetsk. So when talking about Solidar, we can say that this building was taken by the Russians according to the Russian sources, and it's the most important update, because from this building now the Russians are able to develop their bridgehead inside the central part. We talk a lot about this part of residential area. As you can see, there are a lot of high buildings, like 7-9 floors. I don't know, I can't to calculate the real number of floors in this area, but anyway, the Russians managed to enter the town. And furthermore, the Russians, from this small building, they have a small road, as you can see, that moves to the Russian positions in these fields, that the Russians uses to supply and support this area from Yakovlivka. This is Yakovlivka. They are able to use, let's say, these brushes, these local roads along the field. This one, as you can see, there is a road that moves to Yakovlivka, and they can use this road to supply and support, to bring manpower, to bring forces. and to support the Russian forces in this building. Of course, if the Ukrainians have a lot of artillery systems, it won't be a problem because they would be able just to reduce this building to ruins. But we understand that Ukrainians have a lot of problems with artillery. Furthermore, the Ukrainians have a lot of problems with shells for the artillery system. So just from a regular perspective, they are not able to destroy this building. So from this side, the Russians are able to prepare and to reinforce this bridgehead, and from this bridgehead, the Russians are able to attack the Ukrainians on the north of part of Solidar. I will explain you easier. If we talk about Solidar, and if the Russians got established control just over the south part of Solidar, over this railroad station, and if the Russians didn't establish control over this small building, it's a very small building, if you can see, it's maybe sometimes the real battle solved by just a small brushes or small building in any way. If the Russians didn't establish control over this building, I would say that Ukrainians would have possibilities to hold this position, maybe even for months. Because if you take a look at this area, there are a lot of high buildings, and the structure of this area reminds me the structure of Uglidar. Let's take a look at Uglidar. As you can see, there are also high buildings, and the Ukrainians hold these areas since, I don't know, the beginning of the special operation, and the Russians still haven't found any possibilities, any key to crack this area, to find way how to enter this town. So this residential area is, for me, at least for me, is almost the same thing when we talk about Solidar. But the Russians did the most important thing. They managed to enter, they managed to take control over a corner building, and from this moment I believe that we can start counting days before the entire Solidar is going to fall. I can't tell you exactly the real days when it's going to happen, but I believe that in a week or even in 2, everything is going to happen very fast. The entire Solidar is going to fall. The only possible solution for the Ukrainians is to start counter-offensive operation in direction of the north, because the south is not so important. It's also important, but I believe that they do have possibilities to hold their position in the south. The thing that they need to do this day, this minute, this seconds, is to start counter-offensive operation in direction of this building and to force the Russians to step back, if they are able to do this. If they are not able to do this, it's just a waste of time, waste of manpower, waste of soldiers from the Ukrainian side, and anyway, sooner or later they will be collapsed. Now let's return back to the Western Sources map, and let's update Western Sources map according to understanding to the situation that we have right now. The Russians control Belogorovka, Yakovlevka, and when we're talking about Solidar, the Russians control this small building in the west part of this town. So this is the situation in Solidar, and the situation is critical. I will tell you the thing that I thought even today, this morning. I thought that Ukrainians will be able to hold Solidar for more days, and that they will be able to hold Solidar maybe even for months, even for weeks, because of this residential block. But because of the failure on the north part of Solidar in this residential block, I'm talking about this exact area, I believe that Ukrainians will be forced to step back less than in 2 weeks from this area. Of course, anyway, we'll see and we will understand. But if the Russians are able to take Solidar, Solidar is very important. If the Russians are able not just to take Solidar, let's call the things that it has the real names. If the Russians are able to split Seversk from Bakhmut, I believe that entire front line is going to collapse immediately, because these days the Ukrainians continue their offensive operation in the direction of Crimea, and they're doing this operation based on one thing. They understand that they have protected flanks. Any offensive operation, can be done just when you understand that your flanks are completely protected. If you understand that your flanks are not protected, that, I don't know, you need to be a 100% lucky person to do any offensive operation, because any attack in the flanks can ruin your your offensive operation, and you can lose entire army in this area. So when the Ukrainians attack Crimea, they understand that the territory in Seversk, Belogorovka, Serebryanka, Grigorievka are completely protected. But if the Russians are able to take Solidar, and if the Russians are able to take control of these mines, it will be a very perfect bridgehead for the Russians to develop their offensive operation inside of this back that located between Slaviansk, Kramatorsk, Konstantinovka, Druzhevka, Chasov Yar. They will be able to encircle Bakhmut from the north, and you need to understand that Ukrainian forces in Seversk, in Belogorovka, in Liman area will be collapsed automatically. Of course, we won't see like heavy clashes in Liman on Seversk when the Ukrainians tries to keep this area. They will be forced just to step back because they understand that it's not very smart to try to hold this area. It's very difficult to support and supply, and it will be very difficult to stop the Russians from their attacks from the south in direction of Seversk. So this is the reason why the Ukrainians will be able to force to step back from Seversk and to try to establish not like a local, some, I don't know how to call it, temporary defense line along this road rocket M03. M03, they will try to stay here, but also not for a very long time. They will be forced to step back in direction of Slaviansk and Kramatorsk. And this spring, I believe that by the March of this year, we're going to see the final battle for Donbas. And the final battle for Donbas in March, we will see in the area of, in the vicinity of Slaviansk, Kramatorsk, and Konstantinovka. And the result of that battle will determine the next situation in Donbas, in Ukraine, and so on and so on. Anyway, I believe that the Russians are able to win this. For now, the Ukrainians don't have possibilities to stop the Russians. We heard a lot about yesterday's announcement about upcoming help for the Ukrainians. Of course, the Western countries announced about supplying the Ukraine with armored vehicles, Bradley with armored vehicles like Mortar and so on, but you need to understand it's not tanks. It's not Leopards, it's not Abrams tanks, it's not I don't know, the aircrafts like F-16 and so on. It's armored vehicles, and these armored vehicles can't do anything with the Russian tanks. It's just the procedure. The main purpose of is to to get as much as possible time between the entire collapse of Ukraine and the Russian offensive operation. I don't know how to call it. Anyway, it's not. But as soon as we receive updates that the Western countries decided to supply Ukraine with modern tanks and modern aircraft, I would say that yes, there are still possibilities from the Ukrainian side to collapse the Russians, to stop them. But for now, it's just a waste of time. Let's see. Maybe the Ukrainians are so so lucky or so experienced with all this operation, and with help of just the regular infantry without artillery and so on, they are able to stop the Russians. Maybe, who knows? You know that sometimes maybe the luck is on their side. Who knows? Let's follow. Anyway, we'll see sooner or later. But when talking about Donetsk, the Russians reported that during the previous 24 hours, the Ukraine lost around 50 soldiers and around 2 armored vehicles. When talking about South Donetsk area, there are no updates in this area at all. The Russians tries to follow their ceasefire period, and Ukraine lost just 20 soldiers, 3 armored vehicles, and something around 2 artillery system D-30 howitzers. When talking about Bakhmut, when talking about Kupiansk, Ukraine lost just 20 soldiers, 3 armored vehicles, and 1 artillery system, Hrad. And furthermore, as you can see, there are no icons in Kupiansk area at all. When talking about Liman, Ukraine lost another 30 soldiers, 2 armored vehicles, and something around 2 howitzers D-20. As you can see, the Russians tries to follow the ceasefire period, and this ceasefire period, the Russians show some kind of correlation with the losses from the Ukrainian side. They're reduced, as you can see. But this ceasefire was announced by the Russian army, but not by the Wagner, so that's why but the Wagners continue attacking, and as you can see, during the previous 24 hours, they managed to enter Podgorodny, and I believe that these days we're going to see an update about this town. The Russians says that they achieved significant success in Solidar, and maybe this day we'll see entire penetration collapse of Solidar, and furthermore, maybe we're gonna see some updates on Klishevka. And this is very important, of course, but you might ask, how did the Russians manage to achieve such a big success during these days? Maybe they're so powerful, maybe they're so experienced and so on. Yes, they are. Of course, they are. These guys are on the front line, I believe, since the beginning of the special operation and so on. Maybe there were a lot of rotations and so on. But also, we need to take a look at the deployment map, and maybe deployment map may show you or explain you some things in this area as well. And first of all, let's take a look at Solidar. And let's take a look at some updates in this area. Let's take a look at the north one. This is the icon on the north area, north of Solidar. It's 128th Mountain Assault Brigade. And as you can see, this map has been updated, and the Western Sources map, the deployment map, shows that the Ukrainians deployed their 128th Mountain Assault Brigade on the 5th of January on the north of Solidar. To tell the truth, I believe that this update is some soft update or something like this, and they showed like approximate position of this brigade, because during the previous days we received a lot of updates about unfollowing of orders from this brigade, about leaving their positions and so on. So the forces, this brigade have been completely collapsed and defeated, and now I believe the Ukrainians just want to find a solution how to take this brigade from the front line, I don't know, or something like this, but the deployment showed this update, and I believe that it's just like something to show, but these brigades were moved from the front line. Another important update comes from Solidar itself. As you can see, now we see this update is very today's the update on the 7th of January. The Ukrainians moved 46th Air Mobile Brigade inside of Solidar, exactly in the central part of this town. Now let's move to the west, and now let's talk about this update. As you can see, there is another update from 1st Tank Battalion, 17th Tank Brigade, and this is also very fresh update from the 7th of January. The Ukrainians moved their tank brigade to the west part of Solidar. Let's move a little bit to the south, and you're going to see 4th Tank Brigade on the south of Solidar. Also, this is a very fresh update. The Ukrainians moved their 4th Tank Brigade right to the north of Krasnaya Gora and to the west from Solidar, like in the area between these two brigades. Now let's move further. When talking about this icon, also we discussed this icon before, that the Ukrainians deployed 63rd Mechanized Brigade in the back of all these forces. Now let's move to the south. We are going to see there are no updates with 24th Brigade. There are also more updates in this area. Let's find them, and this is it. On the 6th of January, the Ukrainians deployed 61st Mechanized Brigade in Ivanovsk and the west part of Bakhmut. Now let's move further. Now we're going to discuss this. There is another deployment of 60th Mechanized Brigade. This one. This is our 60th Mechanized Brigade that were deployed on the west of Andreevka, Klishevka, another brigade. And another important update is 4th Rapid Response Brigade on the 6th of January. What does it mean? As you can see, we discussed Bakhmut for many times, and as you can see, since the big end of November, the Ukrainians managed to complete at least 3 or 4 rotations, real fully blooded rotations. It is very important. I don't have this information from the Russian side. They're just an offensive state trying to attack the Ukrainians. We heard a lot about the Ukrainian losses, and I can do at least 2 conclusions. The first thing is that Ukrainians have so big losses in Bakhmut Solidar frontline, so that's why they are forced to make rotations so as fast as much as possible. And from the other side, you know that according to the NATO standards, if brigade have losses more than 5%, according to the NATO standards, this brigade should be replaced with another one. So maybe this is just the process that, according to the NATO standards, if brigade have a lot of losses or more than 5%, the Ukrainian military commanders need to replace this brigade with the fresh forces with one purpose: not to ruin or not to reduce the spirit of the Ukrainian army. Anyway, this is the third or maybe the fourth rotation in a row. We discussed rotation process in many times, and as you can see, the Russian progress in Solidar completely meet with the rotation process in Bakhmut. A lot of forces from Ukrainian side have been defeated or had a lot of losses during the previous weeks. The Ukrainians were forced to move their brigade in direction of mainland, to fulfill, to reinforce them, and to move fresh forces to the contact line. And during this process, the Russians managed to achieve some bridgehead. At least they managed to do this in Solidar. So the question is whether there was some kind of a real Russian progress or real Russian attack, or it just was like situation when the Russians meet with the time, with everything they need. They attack completely fresh forces that don't know the situation, they don't know the ground, and maybe this is the reason why these forces were forced to step back. Anyway, for now, it's very early to make any conclusions. We need to follow this situation because, as you can see, according to this map, at least 4 brigades were moved to the Solidar completely fresh. Furthermore, 2 of these brigades are tank brigades. The main purpose of these tank brigades, we understand, to attack the Russian from the distance, to press and pin down the Russian from the distance, not to allow the Russians to penetrate, even if they take control of Solidar, not to allow them to penetrate entire territory deep inside of this back or deep in direction of Kramatorsk-Slaviansk. We'll see this, because if the Russians are able to do this, that means that we are like the witnesses of entire collapse of Ukrainian army. You need to understand that if the Russians, I'll repeat one more time, very slow, just for your better understanding. If today, these days, the Russians are able to take control over Podgorodny, Krasnogorsk, Solidar, and furthermore, if the Russians are able to develop their offensive operation inside of this back along M03 road in direction of Slavyansk-Kramatorsk, you need to understand that this is like a global process of collapsing of Ukrainian army. And this process, and furthermore, the Ukrainians are not able to stop this process. But if this progress from the Russian side is just like the result of this rotation period from the Ukrainian side, when they moved the defeated or damaged brigade and move and replace them by the completely fresh forces, in this case, the Russians are able just to a little bit develop their bridgehead, and we're the witnesses of this. They got control over bigger part of Solidar. But if the Russians are not able to develop, believe me, we're going to see this tomorrow and during the next week. That means that it was just a regular process, rotation process from the Ukrainian side. Yes, they move some forces, but it is much more important and better to lose a few squares and few blocks, but to save the real brigade, to save their spirit and to move them back, to show them some kind of military stability, that it's not just like the Ukrainian military authorities and military commanders don't try to follow the target to destroy their army. They try to do everything professionally. Like you had the damage, and as soon as they get some small window to replace, they try to replace you. All these procedures increases the some kind of respect of military authorities from the Ukrainian side, from the Ukrainian army, and they increase. And now this just regular soldiers on the front line can rely on Ukrainian commanders, because they understand that they're like on the local front line, and this small soldier understand that the commanders understand his position, that if he was damaged, he understands that sooner or later, in an hour, in a day, or in two, he will be replaced by the fresh forces. Of course, this situation can increase the morale and spirit of the army. This ongoing, very well combined, very well stand rotation process. We'll see. We'll see. But the flag for you is that if the Russians are not able to take Solidar, let's say in the next 2 days or next weeks, that means that it was just ongoing rotation process from the Ukrainian side, and at least it won't mean that Ukrainians are collapsed and their army were ruined or something like this. And that means that Ukrainians will still try to hold this position and will still try to give a fight for the Russians, at least until the March, because, as you know, by the March, the Ukrainians will receive another supply and support from the Western countries, another armored vehicles, tanks, and so on. And according to the Western sources, the Ukrainians are planning to start offensive operation or counter-offensive operation somewhere in March, and we'll see what is going to be by this time. And that's it for today. Military Summer Channel reminds you, condemn any violence in Ukraine. Thank you for your watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon. Have a good day. Bye bye.